Good morning to everyone. We've got Paul Watchman, Dinesh Goel from India, Mervyn King, Cape Town, Kun Kasemsit from Thailand, Azumi Sin from Tokyo, and Alexandra Noble from the UK. And with no further ado, I would like to welcome everybody, welcome our participants. We'll have a few more people joining, I'm sure, in the next few minutes. But welcome to our speakers and to our respondents. We're delighted to have what I'd term a rainbow of nations around the table, from South Africa, India, Thailand, Australia, the UK, Japan, and others besides. So first of all, let me introduce myself. It's Paul Clement Hunt, and we're convening the final stage of an 8-month-long process, which has been to look at business beyond COVID-19. So it's run since last June, where Judge Professor Mervyn King, Professor Paul Watchman, and the United Nations in South Africa helped us to kick off. And the process, very briefly on context, is that what we've done is we've looked at what is business best practice in terms of mitigating the challenges and risks around COVID-19. But we've moved on in the debate with the glimmer of light offered by the vaccine in different countries, despite the tragedy of the ongoing pandemic. We're now looking at the business response beyond COVID. And one of the key questions we have is how can business and the investment community, and how can other aspects of the business world, whether it's legal or professional services, how can that agglomerated global business community respond to the pandemic and help to rebuild communities and societies, to help entrepreneurs, to help other businesses, perhaps a particular focus on the developing world, with the results, the economic and social results of the pandemic are being felt in a very, very harsh way. So that's the context. We have a robust open discussion. We will take this discussion this Thursday, the 28th, and report our recommendations of the course of the past 8 months to the United Nations World Investment Forum. We're working with UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and the World Investment Forum team there, to present recommendations across their ecosystem. Today's recording will be amplified and repeated in various channels, but including on the UN platform. So in time, we hope it will reach scores, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And again, let me welcome you before I pass over to Judge Professor Mervyn King, who's very kindly, with Professor Watchman, helped us to anchor this process over the course of the next few months. I will be moderating through the course of the morning. And with that, I would hand over to Judge Professor King to make opening comments. And Judge Professor, how do we come out of this? How do we rebuild? What does business have to do? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction. Of course, leading up to a post-COVID situation is the pre-COVID situation. And boards have to think and have to have a mindset that is integrated, collaborative under SDG 17, and compromising, because they have to take account not only of the needs, interests, and expectations of the stakeholders of a company, but have to also take account of the hardships they've suffered during 2020 and continuing in 2021 with the various restrictions in various countries. So you've got impacts not only flowing from the virus itself, but you've got impacts on economies, crises. You've got an economic crisis and a viral crisis. And that's why I've coined the word coronanomics, to put the two together, that directors have to see this as a double crisis, economic as well as viral. So thinking short term doesn't discharge the duty of care to a company. Directors have to think long term, as you say, when we reach that herd community, hopefully through a series of vaccinations, the board has to think now long term what is going to happen. And of course, there are two critical risks to a company when we come out of COVID, and that is cybersecurity and climate change. And what is pertinent to the business of the company, that sustainable development goal should be built into the business model. And the mindset long-term has to be about enterprise value creation. So we know about sustainability reporting from the GRI, which went back to 1997, and I was its chairman, as you know, Paul. And sustainability reporting is to look at the impacts of a company's activities and its product has on the three critical dimensions for sustainable development: the economy, society, and the environment. But the great institutions of the world like IFAC, SASB, GRI, the IIRC, of which I'm chairman emeritus, we have formed a group of 5, and we are working with other global institutions to look at enterprise value creation, preservation, and erosion. So enterprise value creation is the other side of the sustainability coin. We look at what are these 3 critical dimensions: the economy, society, and the environment. What impact is it having on the company? What impact is it having on its financial condition, its balance sheet, its operating performance, income statement, and cash flows, and its risk profile, its market valuation, market cap, and its cost of capital? So we're starting to look at sustainability not only through a civil society lens, but also through an enterprise value creation lens. And I think that change in understanding has to be built into the mindset of that collective mind of boards of companies. In the next 18 months, 2 years, when hopefully we come out of this pandemic and get to that stage of what is known as herd immunity. So both short-term to get there, we have to have a compromising mindset to take account of the hardships suffered by our stakeholders, and the stakeholders have to equally compromise because the companies are suffering hardships under the coronanomics. And that's to get to the post-COVID situation, which I think is going to take 18 months to 2 years. But during that time, we have to think long-term and make sure our business model is ready to cope with the resurgence of our economy from survive mode to thrive mode. And we are ready from a strategy point of view to push our businesses forward, but make sure it can cope with the huge changes and adverse impacts from climate change. Thank you.
Mervyn, thank you very much for those opening comments. I mean, again, you have a feeling for the last 7 or 8 months, and I think one of the things we've all come to understand is just how deep the uncertainty of the pandemic is. And what we're hoping this morning is to move from your comments to Professor Watchman now, but then to visit different countries and get a sense of where they are, the business community in the crisis within the pandemic, and then moving, what is the evolving vision despite the uncertainty that we have? We have the hope of the vaccines, but there is still great uncertainty. And I think that's one of the ongoing challenges for everybody. But again, Professor King, thank you for your opening comments as ever, greatly appreciated. And I will move on to Professor Paul Watchman, I believe in Suffolk, and heralding from Scotland originally. And Paul is an honorary professor of law at the University of Glasgow, as well as many other positions that he holds, and was previously a senior partner with Freshfields Brookhouse Derringer. And Paul may touch on the legal context of where we are and where we've come from. So Paul Watchman, over to you. And again, great thanks for having anchored this process with your colleague, Judge Professor King.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I would like to thank Professor King for his introduction. I thought I would start by rolling us back to the beginning of the century. I don't want to go any further than that. But if you remember, in the year 2000, we were very concerned about the millennium bug and various other matters. that investors were rewarded in a very short-term basis, and they had a short-term horizon. Things like climate change science was being challenged. ESG had not been invented as an acronym, so thank you for that, Paul. Sustainable finance was not there, because the Equator Principles didn't come in to a few years later, and when they came in, they were a very sickly child, although they've become more robust over time. And you didn't get the word business often bracketed with the words human rights. So I think we have moved in the last 10 to 15 years a great deal, and hopefully some of the work that Paul and I did on the Freshfields report on sustainable finance and fiduciary duties has helped that progress. What I thought I would do today is to look at what I think has happened during the pandemic and what might follow, and particularly focusing on the contribution that may be made by the legal profession. So the 6 areas I've noted is divestment and investment, climate change, litigation, supply chains and the robustness, and employment rights. So if I start with the divestment and investment, we have seen a record number of ESG funds created and a record number of people divesting and institutions divesting in non-ESG friendly funds such as fossil fuels and into ESG funds. Cambridge University, for example, after many years of deliberation, have now committed to withdrawing from fossil fuels. Climate change is becoming the issue. The pandemic's there, and I think what's really interesting is climate change, the wildfires, the rising of seas and oceans, and flooding have all come together like a perfect storm. So people are they are imprisoned, if you like, in their bubbles. At the same time, we're looking at the planet moving in a very dangerous way. But we have to see opportunities as well as risks. There are opportunities in terms of climate change, and the BP, which is one of the oil majors, announced a few months ago that it was moving away from oil and gas, away from fossil fuels and into renewables. And we see that trend with other oil companies, other energy companies moving away and looking at ways in which they can make a profitable and positive contribution. Litigation is quite interesting. After a number of years of being relatively unsuccessful, litigation has become successful in Holland and in the United States by changing the tack away from toxic torts and legal liability towards stock exchange matters, the disclosure of risk, the implementation of plans. So that's a nice change. And supply chains and business and human rights, I think we can see not only the supply chain issues becoming more prominent, but we can see that with companies like Boohoo and at the other end, Unilever, an understanding that you have to make sure that your supply chain is robust and there's no exploitation either in terms of payment or in terms of labour going down the line. And the last thing I wanted to touch on just before talking about the legal profession a little is employment. The pandemic has done something that I never thought I'd see before. People now are home workers or they're flexible workers, and their exposure to things like the viruses have been well documented. We had the Boohoo case up in Leicestershire, which brought it in the UK home that this is not just a Asian problem, it's a global problem. So on law firms, what's one of the really interesting things, and Paul and I have been looking at that with a team of people recently, and that is that law firms have moved into the ESG space, but not only have they moved into it, they've developed it in a more integrated way. So we see the large London and New York law firms, but also in countries like Australia, in Hong Kong and other areas, looking at ESG as an area where they should be involved. And that has had a profound impact on the culture of law firms. You can't say that you support carbon reduction or carbon zero if you are actively advising on projects which go in the opposite direction. And we've seen that recently with coal mines in Germany and other countries. So how do we get from where we are today to the post-COVID world? And I would say that looking back on the Freshfields report, which was 2005, there was, if you like, a number of critical steps. You had Freshfields, and then you had the financial problems of the 2007, 2014, and then moving forward, we've had the pandemic. So what we can see is that although it takes a long time for the wheel to turn fully, that we are moving away from just metrics, we're moving away from greenwashing to the repurposing of companies, the adoption of a stakeholder rather than a shareholder model, and also law firms asking themselves the critical question, can we square acting for certain clients, carrying out certain activities with our duty to the planet and to society as a whole? So I think those are really important changes that I would like to note. Thank you.
Professor Watchman, thank you very much. Let me conflate a couple of things from Judge Professor King and yourself. What I'm hearing is clearly in the context of the world we live in, there is at a systemic level, there's a convergence and perhaps an amplification of risk, whether that's because we're on a planet now of 7.8 billion, which will, as we know, rise to between 9 and 10 by the end of the century. But, you know, if you go to the fundamentals of this pandemic, we hear that it's a zoonotic novel virus. One of the reasons that it might have come to the fore is because of the boundaries between human beings and animals are being reduced in some ways because of impacts on the natural environment. Climate change, clearly a systemic risk. You can look at the financial crash of 2007-8, there's another systemic risk. What I hear from Professor King is that absolute need for business to think in a more integrated manner and to manage systemic risks going forward, but not as something exceptional. It's becoming part of our business reality. And if we don't take them into account on an increasingly crowded and stressed planet, that becomes an issue. When we switch across to Professor Watchman, again, what I take away and what I'm hearing is that we're seeing a shift in different business sectors in terms of appreciation of systemic risk. And we're now seeing that come full cascade into the legal world, where, you know, the legal companies underpin so much of our capital market and our business work, business thinking, are looking at it in a more holistic way. I mean, Professor King, Professor Watchman, is that a fair takeaway? The critical need for integrated thinking, the shift to the shareholder, way beyond the shareholder, to the stakeholder, corporate thinking, and that idea that the very mechanics, the underpinning of our capital markets and business, there is greater thought given to systemic risk. Mervyn, briefly, and then Paul, is that a fair capture of some of your much broader points?
Well, what is critical is that there has to be integrated thinking by a board and no longer thinking in silos. And I've always said the wonderful thing about integrated reporting is it drives people to think on an integrated basis. And the revolutionary immensity of integrated reporting is integrated thinking. And the Bastille of integrated thinking has been stormed around the world. Very few organizations, let alone companies limited by liability, operate on a basis of still thinking in silos. They all are starting to think on an integrated basis. And we've got SDG-17 now, which is collaboration. And that's why I said, in the short term, when we're in survival mode, a board has to think on an integrated, collaborative, but compromising mindset, because you have to deal not only with the needs, interests, and expectations of all stakeholders, because the primacy of the shareholder is yesterday's thinking, but the hardships they've suffered because of the virus and because of the restrictions through the lockdown provisions, and hence the coining of the word coronanomics. It's a double crisis. And they have to think of this, but at the same time, to discharge the duty of care to the company, you have to think long-term. You have to continue thinking long-term. And the two critical risks are climate change and cybersecurity. And you can wash your hands, you can have disinfectants, you can wear a mask. These are remedies for the virus, but none of these remedies will help you with climate change. So you need that mindset shift to deal long-term with these issues and make sure how the company makes its money is actually dealing from a strategic point of view with the impacts which society and the environment is going to have on the company. I called it the other side of the sustainability coin. And this is enterprise value creation. So long-term, you have to think of enterprise value. And you can no longer just think, and I quote the words of the GRI in the Group of Five statement issued in about September, October last year, that the GRI standards are there to illuminate, their word, the impacts of how the company makes its money and its product has on the three critical dimensions for sustainable development, which means development which won't prejudice the development, the ability to develop of those who come after us. But the other side of the coin is that society and the environment and the economy have a huge impact on the company, on its balance sheet, on its income statement, and its risk profile. So one has to think about that as well. So, for example, society, you've got the pandemic, you've got health and safety issues, huge impact on companies. From a governance point of view, you have to start thinking on an outcomes-based basis. No longer a set of rules, do this, do that, and just mindlessly tick it. You've got to apply your mind to make sure the outcomes are you've got value creation in a sustainable manner, for example. And so the thinking has got to change, and we have to get that mindset right. So when we get to that herd immunity, we can actually move our companies to the thrive mode when economies start thriving again.
Again, Professor King, thank you very much. Paul, I'm going to come to you briefly. Again, in terms of your own comments, simple question. Do you think the shift within, there's this issue that when we get back to whatever the new normal is, that memories will fade very quickly and we'll just go back to business as normal. Do you think that the severity and impact of the pandemic is such that this is an inflection, legal world or elsewhere? Paul, over to you, and then we will conclude the opening comments.
Yeah, I think there's always the danger that we go back, that we forget what we've gone through. I think we saw that a bit with the financial crisis. But at the same time, I think that I have seen, the first time in my lifetime, a very major shift in legal services. This is like company law has suddenly been discovered, or limited liability. Lawyers are putting a great deal of effort into understanding things in an integrated way. And I would just like to echo what Professor King has said. It's not just the integration, it's the time horizon. And I was trying to emphasize earlier that we were in a society for a number of years where if we hadn't lost our moral compass, we weren't using it very often. And that was, we were looking for short-term rewards, and we were just focusing on the bottom line. Now, over the years, that has changed and is changing. I'm not saying it's perfect. There will be companies which present themselves in a way which is not justified by what they actually do on the ground. But what I would say is that I have noticed in relation to companies, particularly at general counsel level, there is a problem and a challenge at board level. There's been some recent research done showing that the majority of board members are not equipped to deal with ESG issues. So there's a training and there's a perception issue there that has to be done. But what I think is it's going to be very, very difficult, because at the same time as this is happening within business, there's huge changes in government in terms of the duties of directors, in terms of transparency, in terms of what financial institutions have to report on and what companies have to report on. And I think that's where Professor King's absolutely right. When you have certain requirements that cause you to go beyond box ticking, cause you to think things through in a more holistic way, you make a really important change. And that's what I've noticed. Although I will confess that everything moves much more glacially than I'd hoped for, but it is moving, and I can see it moving and accelerating because of the pandemic.
Professor Watchman and Professor King, thank you for enlivening the discussion with those opening comments. I'm glad you're staying with us through the rest of the discussion, and that we'll link back to you at various points. But again, thank you for the opening comments. In some ways, the paraphrasing Milton Friedman, the business of business is business. Maybe it's now the business of business is the planet and its people, and that we have to move on to that that new nomina. Good, thank you very much. So the way the session is structured is that we have two panels with a number of speakers, and then with a respondent. And our respondent today, I'm glad to say, is Alexandra Noble from Pensions with Purpose in the UK. So I will now open panel one. I'm delighted also to see Anne-Marie O'Connor from New Zealand Super. So we've got a full stretch from Tokyo through New Zealand, UK, Cape Town, Bangkok, we've got India, and delighted to have everybody on board. So the first panel, I'm going to go to Jeff Kendall, who's the co-founder of Future Fit Foundation in the UK. And Jeff, I know your expertise is far and wide, but you're perhaps going to look at some of the systemic issues here in terms of what we're learning from the panel. After that, I will go to a dear friend from Siena Capital in India, Dinesh Goel, who we're delighted to have, who are breaking new ground in terms of asset management and sustainability in India with a fabulous and interesting fund model. And then we will go to Anne-Marie O'Connor with one of, I think it's fair to say, one of the most successful sovereign wealth funds in the world. We'll finish there before going to Alexandra. So Jeff, the floor is yours, and thank you to the Future Fit Foundation.
Thank you, Paul, and yeah, it's great to be here. So as Paul mentioned, I'm CEO and co-founder of Future Fit Foundation. Really happy to be here with you today. We're a UK charity, and our mission is to catalyse rapid and radical transformation in the global economy. So we do that by translating system science into practical, free-to-use tools for companies and investors. Now, I'll come back to our work in a few minutes, but first I want to step back and make 3 observations about how we got here, to learn from as we build back better. So the first is what we might call the mitigation paradox. And that's the fact that the cost of maintaining stockpiles of personal protective equipment, or PPE, and the infrastructure to rapidly roll out testing and tracing would have been nothing compared to the trillions of dollars governments have spent on recovery over the past year. But previous pandemics had never caused anything like this much disruption. So why would nations have wasted money preparing for this one? This is the mitigation paradox. Success fosters cynicism. Prepare well, and it appears that the preparation was unnecessary because the fallout is small. Fail to prepare, and the impact is huge. Mitigation might feel expensive, but is far less so than adaptation. This is a really sobering lesson, and one which we really should be heeding in the fight against climate change. But that's a whole other topic. So I'll move on to my second observation about the pandemic, and that is the illusion of resilience. So if the pandemic's shown us one thing, it's that our economy is nowhere near as resilient as many of us assumed. In our relentless pursuit of cost efficiency, we've built vast and complex value webs across the globe, dependent on just-in-time supply chains, which are extremely vulnerable to interruption. And with millions of small businesses and families across the world living hand to mouth, any temporary disruption to income can have devastating and long-lasting effects. The current stimulus programs, even though they are massive and unprecedented, are only staunching the wound. The countless companies and jobs which have been lost simply won't reappear as vaccination programs ramp up. But experts have been warning us for years that a pandemic like this would happen. So why was that advice ignored? Well, probably because those in power did not grasp the true socioeconomic costs of such an event. And that brings us to my third point, which is the limitations of GDP. So this extends way back before the pandemic. So GDP has been the overriding metric which nation states have focused on as the measure of progress since just after World War II. As a result, our global economy has basically evolved to become a GDP maximization engine. But GDP is just a measure of how much money is flowing through the economy. It says nothing about the quality of the outcomes for people or planet which result from all those flows. This is like sitting in a car and slamming down on the gas to get the engine turning as quickly as possible without checking whether the car is actually in gear and going in a useful direction. And the main reason governments didn't invest in pandemic preparations is because the socioeconomic benefits of such spending were not really adequately represented in their models and on their balance sheets because of this relentless focus on dollars at the cost of all else. Put simply, we need more systemic metrics if we want to foster resilience and regeneration. So where do we go from here? Well, if we're to build back better, we need to embrace this more holistic view of value creation and progress, as Professor Watchman alluded to. We need a way to tell how every decision we make will affect people and planet. And that's what our work at Future Fit Foundation is all about. Earth and social systems scientists have done the heavy lifting. For decades, they've known what we must do and not do to strengthen our social foundations and to operate within planetary boundaries. But often that knowledge is buried in academic journals and is too complex and abstract to be easily put into practice. So the rules of the game have been written, but they're in a language most people can't read. So what our team has done is translate that science into a methodology to help any organization assess the social and environmental or extra financial impacts of its actions, both positive and negative. And we call this methodology the Future Fit Business Benchmark. It's free for anyone to download and use. You can find out more at futurefitbusiness.org. It defines the line in the sand grounded in system science, which all businesses must strive to reach. This includes goals from paying employees a living wage and using only renewable energy to eliminating greenhouse gas emissions and product waste. And it helps any business measure its progress toward these goals and explain that progress in a way their employees, customers, and investors can understand. You can think of it as a kind of sat-nav to success for the 21st century. This is about navigating systemic risks and opportunities in pursuit of a clear destination. And it's important to stress this is a fundamental mindset shift for most businesses. Many business leaders today think that leadership means being slightly ahead of your peers, even if the sector that you're in is wholly unsustainable. I believe the benchmark can guide all socioeconomic actors on their journey to creating a truly regenerative and resilient economy. Let's look quickly at companies. So responding to the SDGs effectively is not as easy as it might seem. What must a CEO do to ensure her company plays its part to prevent poverty or halt climate change or foster responsible consumption? Future Fit helps business leaders answer these questions so they know exactly how they need to transform their operations, products, and supply chains to ensure they're helping and in no way hindering progress toward the SDGs. We've also done a lot in the last 2 or 3 years to ensure the benchmark is useful and usable, not just to global companies, but to SMEs too. Now, this is really important coming out of the pandemic, partly because SMEs make up the vast majority of businesses around the world, but also because many small business owners really want to do the right thing, but lack the time and expertise to figure out what that means. So that's companies. Quick look at as well at investors. We don't have time to get into the reasons why, but today's corporate ESG data is really not fit for purpose. It lacks structure and consistency, is backward looking, and is focused almost exclusively on negative risks. We can't expect investors to steer their capital toward companies who are really part of the solution if they can't spot who they are. What investors need is concise, comparable, forward-looking information on companies, which captures all of their impacts, both positive and negative, in a holistic way. And working with a handful of progressive asset managers and pension funds, we've developed a completely new kind of Future Fit disclosure to give them exactly that. I just want to end on an optimistic note. If there's a silver lining from the past 12 months, it's that many wealthy people are starting to realize that their security lies not in the diversity of their portfolios, but in the health of the companies, communities, and infrastructure which underpin them. We've now been working on the benchmark for 7 years, and it's fair to say that many people have struggled to really get why what we're doing matters to them specifically. And there are signs that this began to change when the pandemic hit. Since April, 4 separate banks have come to us knocking on our door with the same question. They've all asked us, can FutureFit help the businesses in our loan book to identify and improve their impacts? Now, collectively, these banks support hundreds of thousands of business clients around the world, so their potential to drive change is massive. But they're not banging on our door through some sudden flash of altruism. They're asking because they know that their own resilience depends on their clients' resilience. And that's a really good thing. If there's one thing that's going to get us out of this mess, it's a healthy blend of enlightened self-interest and mutual encouragement in pursuit of a shared destination that benefits us all. Thanks for giving me the time to speak. I look forward to a rich discussion. Back to
Jeff,
you.
not at all. And a question straight back to you for a brief answer. I mean, you flag up obviously the issue of systemic risk and that ability to understand it. I know if you take the UK, so pandemic was the #1 issue on the Cabinet Office risk register for 5 years. And the former Secretary of State for Health, Jeremy Hunt, has admitted, he now chairs the Health Cross Committee in Parliament, but he's admitted that they got it wrong on PPE and so many different things. You've got on the risk register in the Cabinet a clear signal, we have to take this into account. Why, both on the political side and perhaps the business side, why are people deaf to that? And do you think there'll be a fundamental change with the pandemic, or we'll just go back to business as usual? Why can people ignore signals like that?
I think it is this we evolved on the plains of Africa, Paul, and we evolved with a very kind of clear sense that effect follows cause, stimulus response, right? Something runs towards you with big teeth, you run the other way. Okay, very proximal stuff. And what we're talking about here is that our current situation depends on things that happen on the other side of the world and can impact us within, days, even hours, when it comes to things like, digital financial transactions. And I think that the government really did think, well, if we need PPE, we'll buy it, right? And not realizing that if everyone in the world was thinking the same thing, well, then who's making the PPE and where's it coming from? And, at that point, can we rely on all planes arriving when they're supposed to, and so forth? So I think it really is this lack of systemic decision-making and understanding. And that's why we need to look at this in holistic terms.
Jeff, we're going to go to India now in about a minute, but just to finish off there, look, I know from my own sort of professional experience that the World Health Organization, in terms of the unit within the WHO to manage pandemics, if you go back a decade, was unbelievably under-resourced by governments. To the point they've managed really well in the context of Ebola and different crises. My feeling was that unit within the World Health Organization should have been funded and resourced like the richest hedge fund imaginable in terms of heading off these risks. And I do hope we learn those lessons, because it is about collaboration. It is about resourcing and understanding the fifth risk, if you've read the book by Michael Lewis. But it is that we need a World Health Organization funded and resourced like nothing else on the planet. And I will not move from that opinion. We don't want them to behave like a hedge fund, but they need the resources. So let me move on. I can see that it's now dusk, certainly in Tokyo. It looks like midday-ish with a beautiful sunshine in India. So Dinesh Goel of Sienna Capital, a partner in Sienna Capital, welcome. We'd love your feeling and flavor of where we are with the Indian business and investor community in the context of the pandemic, but also maybe touch upon how Sienna Capital sees the importance of sustainability in terms of your offering and where that's come from. But over to you, Dinesh, and we're delighted to have India as part of this conversation. So the floor is yours. Thank you. And thank you, Jeff Kendall. Dinesh, we can't hear you. Maybe on mute. I can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me and having me on this panel. Happy to share our perspective of both the Indian economy with respect to the pandemic, as well as our business at Sienna Capital. So just a few words on Sienna Capital. I mean, we started this as a fund to invest in deep science and technology-based innovations, which are in some shape or form advancing the cause of progress on SDGs or ESG for that matter. There are few firms, very few venture capital firms in India who actually focus on original innovations. As the panel might be aware, that a lot of innovations that have happened in India in the last 8 to 10 years are essentially creating local models of what might have transpired in places like US and Europe and things like that. But what we noticed when we started Sienna Capital was there is a new wave which is sort of gaining strength in creating original innovations and solving problems with the use of science and technology in a deeper way, in addressing the local problems of a nation like India, right? I mean, we all know that we have a lot of basic issues with respect to access and affordability of education, healthcare, and productivity and efficiency and so on and so forth. And we at Sienna Capital felt that there is a opportunity to identify and support these entrepreneurs who are developing these products, platforms, solutions, if you will, to solve some of these problems. Now, going back to the economy and the pandemic as a flavor from India. So, as we all know that the government in India hard stance early last year, beginning of March, and imposed a very longish sort of a lockdown in the entire country, right? Arguably, we have come out very well because of that in terms of mortality and in terms of the infection rates and things like that. But as you can imagine, it has created a huge impact on the society and the economy in terms of the progress, right? Particularly, I would like to point out that the bottom of the pyramid population, right, the underprivileged sort of population, you can call them unskilled workers or blue collar workers, which is a huge chunk in India, faced significant financial stress because of these lockdowns, right? And they form a very vast majority of the immigrant population that works in the bigger cities or the urban locations of India. And the moment the lockdowns were announced, I mean, they couldn't go to their jobs. Depending on the sector you were in, many of them were sort of laid off and lost their jobs and created unemployment. And they had to relocate back to their hometowns, and it created huge physical, emotional, financial stress on that population. And there, I would say, while the economy is recovering at this point, but that stress is still there, and it is going to take some time before it goes away. While the numbers suggest that the unemployment has been trending down, I just saw some numbers this morning that the rural unemployment has gone down, and the overall unemployment has gone down because most of the industries and sectors are back. But it's going to take some time, like I said, for the restoration of this dislocated and stressed population. The good thing is that there was a special fund called Prime Minister Cares Fund, which was launched by our Prime Minister Modi, and that received huge amount of funding and support, which was kind of a good signal from both businesses and the society. So a lot of that is being spent in funding special programs to help the stressed sectors of the economy as well as the stressed sections of the population of the economy. So that's helping. And also there's a regulation in India, in case you don't know, which requires that 2% of the bottom line of the corporates needs to be spent on CSR, corporate social responsibility. So a lot of that money is being channelized to alleviate the stress that the pandemic has caused since the January of 2020. So the other thing that we noticed, and a lot of studies have been done to report that, and this is probably a global phenomenon, not just India, that the 2020 unfortunately has reverts the trend of creating more inequality in the society, right? So rich people have become richer and the poor people have become poorer. So the gap actually has increased rather than decreased. So there's divergence there, which is unfortunate. But you know, we believe that having said all that, specifically speaking from India perspective, to a degree it applies to the rest of the world as well. That the whole innovation ecosystem, the entrepreneurial-led innovation ecosystem, which has greater and greater amount of risk capital available now, is going to actually play a very, very important role in the coming decade to solve some of these problems at scale and use technology to address the issues of affordable products and accessibility of products and things like that in the remote areas of the country. And hopefully that will allow mainstreaming of some of these quote unquote excluded sections of the society and will enable them to join the proverbial economic highway, which will lead to their progress. We've made. I take pride in saying that. I mean, we are at a juncture where we are still building our portfolio from the fund, but given our thesis and focus, we've made a couple of very interesting investments. I can talk about one in the interest of time, not all of them. We've made a recent investment in an agricultural technology company, which is offering agronomy-based advice to an individual small farmer with a small land who doesn't have access to that scientific knowledge, which helps them apply the right inputs on their land and helps them improve their crop productivity and yield. And it also helps them improve their farmers' family income as a result of that. And this company also provides at a doorstep the types of inputs that they need in terms of pesticides, insecticides, fertilizers, and things like that, which they advise them on. And they're already serving 500,000 farmers in one state of the country. So we feel very good about the impact companies like those and the products like those which can bring to that section of the population. Similarly, we also notice that instead of expecting, which is what the world has been doing so far, that we expect that people who are not well educated and who are not from the rich class or rich sections of the society, we expect them to progress in life by learning English and by getting themselves educated somehow. But what we notice is actually technology is reversing the trend. And with the use of vernacular languages, automatic speech recognition, with all the plumbing that has happened in India, I mean, smartphones are ubiquitous and broadband connections are available almost everywhere in such a vast country. In fact, the technology is reaching the masses and speaking to them in their language, which will make the transition faster and which will enable these people to join the social communities and e-commerce and services that they either could not consume and hence become part of the nation as well as part of the rest of the world. Let me stop there, and I would end by saying that there is a great amount of hope that we have, and I personally have, that the innovation ecosystem would alleviate a lot of this pain in the coming decade.
Dinesh, thank you very much indeed for that input. And just let me make one comment to link some of your thoughts. I know the image was repeated in many places worldwide, a tragic image, but as the pandemic hit, the images from India of the informal workers leaving for home and in some circumstances traveling hundreds of miles was ones which really resonated with people. And it's to play to Jeff's point, I think, in some ways, in terms of that in the informal economy, that fundamentally global supply chains will to a certain extent depend upon those informal workers around the world, whether in India or other parts of the global economy. And that this idea of the informality and the lack of safety net, I think, has exposed one of the fault lines in terms of that global economic model. Jeff, I don't know if you agree with that, But the question there is, you know, we have within the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the goals, I forget the number, but it's about decent jobs and decent work. And this idea that if you're in work, you deserve some security and dignity. Dinesh, just very briefly, are you optimistic that, you know, in the Indian context, that might be something the government's thinking about and moving to, as difficult as it is in terms of the scale of the problem? Some form of formalization, some form of safety net that gives workers some protection going forward?
Yeah, great question, Paul. Yeah, I mean, it's, as you pointed out, it's a gigantic issue in terms of its scale, right? And a lot of these informal, unprotected, vulnerable workers are unfortunately employed by what we have millions of small and medium enterprises here in India, right? So I think, I mean, my thought would be that it will happen over time, but it will be a slow journey because government is aware of that. They're already sort of implementing, as we noticed 6 months ago or thereabout. There are some labor reform laws which have been passed by the parliament in India. There are some farmer reforms which have been launched, but which have gone into some political quagmire right now, if you read the press, and that's creating a little bit of a crossfire between the different political constituencies. But the reality is, I'm just mentioning to say that the government is very well aware of it, and I think we have a good government in place with clear majority after a long time. So there is hope that things will change along with innovation and government policies and regulatory framework. But I think realistically it will take a long time given the scale of the problem.
Dinesh, thank you very much. And I guess as I go to Anne-Marie O'Connor at the New Zealand Super Fund now, there's a thought there that perhaps global business and global investors have some form of responsibility to push for and advocate a firming up of decent employment, decent jobs, in terms of we simply cannot have a global workforce with no safety net. And that is a very difficult thing. But Dinesh, thank you for your comments. Anne-Marie, not sure what time of day it is in New Zealand. I guess your sun may have gone down. Delighted to have New Zealand Super on board. As an institution, you've led so firmly amongst the world's biggest asset owners on the move to sustainability, what you've done on climate change, what you've done on the One Planet Climate Agreement. So it's great to have New Zealand on board. And Anne-Marie, the floor is yours for comments from a significant global asset owner. Anne-Marie.
Tēnā koutou, thank you for having me here. You raised the issue, Paul, about integrated thinking and integrated solving or integrated solutions. And I think one of the really big challenges that we have, and the response to COVID shows that we're capable of doing this, and that is really robust governance between all the key governance bodies. So that means the governing bodies of companies, governments, investors, and NGOs. And also the consumer element. We're all consumers, all of our companies are consumers. So I really see this as something where it's actually vital all these bodies are working together. To me, that's stakeholder capitalism. It's not just about changing the fiduciary responsibilities of one of those governing bodies. It's actually about them all working together. And that has been demonstrated through the Paris Accord and the Paris Agreement, where we had business and NGOs and investors and government coming together to make those very important commitments. And it's been demonstrated in the response to COVID-19, where we have produced vaccines at a very rapid rate and on a large scale, which has, of course, demonstrated what the world can do. We have these interrelated relationships and connections. We are multinationals, and that brings it some challenges as well as its opportunities. So Build Back Better is a focus on these systemic issues. Climate change has to some extent led the way. COVID-19 has shone a light, as you say, Paul, on jobs, and actually it's shone a light into workplaces in each of our own countries to show some of the conditions there where you could not actually create a safe space or safe place for workers. It's also a systemic issue around biodiversity and natural resources. So really the consumer society that our economies depend on cannot continue in the same way if we're going to have a sustainable approach to natural capital. Nevertheless, the digital revolution, I think, that's come out of COVID could provide for other types of jobs. One of the things that the digital connectiveness that we all have now has done is that it can remove some of those barriers towards people working together. And it has shown that you can get good information if you're really wanting to track things. We're now tracking through apps people's movements in order to combat COVID-19. It just shows the way that we can scale up solutions to things like life cycle and supply chain analysis and getting good information to the right people. Once again, that's also a governance issue. So boards, yes, ESG reporting's important, but I don't think one should let the perfection be the enemy of the good, because there's other ways of getting good information to key decision makers. And sometimes the key decision makers just do not have that sort of visibility, not only through their own operations, but the interconnectedness of their boundaries of operation. So we're all being challenged about these boundaries. As investors, your shareholders in companies, how far does your responsibility go? And I think the legal, ramping up of legal attention to this is both, will spur people on to good action, but it could also lead to defensiveness. So we must have a good information, good governance, and robust discussions around this, and leadership. And leadership came out at the heart of our Sustainable Finance Forum recommendations down here in New Zealand, because we recognise that leaders promoting a social purpose along with should be at the heart of their organisation. The reason that we have to work together is obviously to overcome and sweep away those barriers. And for investors, market and fiscal incentives are one of those sorts of things that which are very difficult, but really vital, and can, if you work together, obviously, be pivoted to the right way, much as you're seeing pivoting away from fossil fuel subsidization, for example. So large asset owners have a real responsibility and opportunity in their own markets. And the One Planet Sovereign Wealth Fund initiative that we have been a founding member of has really shown that we can learn from other sovereign wealth funds, particularly in markets, emerging markets, frontier markets, where we don't have the confidence to invest directly. The risk seems high, yet we can learn from others through those sort of mechanisms. Also in our own markets, with our own stock exchanges, we can raise the bar and encourage the right sort of behaviours and practices, and the information needed to really make some good analysis of what you're investing in. In terms of investing at scale and achieving the SDGs, I think sometimes investors at the moment are so busy with their new tools and new data and new excitement around whether you can integrate impact metrics into the global index, that they tend to forget that to achieve the sustainable development goals requires massive investment into frontier markets and emerging markets, where some of the most vulnerable communities and countries are. But of course, these countries have their own companies and their own knowledge and their own information, which can help de-risk through knowledge and case studies, investments from elsewhere in the world. One of the most successful ways of investing at scale has been bonds through the IFC and World Bank. And I think that provides a real opportunity, and we need to keep working on bonds in all sorts of targeted ways, social bonds, targeting key areas of need. And we need to engage with multinational companies that are bringing that investment into areas of need and communities of need, and not to do that in an abusive way or opportunistic way in terms of just looking for the cheapest way to produce a good. Because that will not sustain them in the end, because their brand now and the information that people can get on companies' operations is now going to be made even more powerful through these new collaborative platforms like Zoom, for example, as we are here. This sort of educations and good information will be a challenge with all the misinformation in the world. So, of course, scaling jobs that have a good, high social impact and are safe. I think that what we're seeing is we're seeing things like the Modern Slavery Acts really jumping ahead of companies and investors, because we haven't solved the problem ourselves. So if companies and investors don't want to report on every single issue, I think they need to take a holistic approach and jump ahead and really focus on what is sustainable in the future in terms of use of our natural resources and use of our human capital. Thank you, Paul.
Anne-Marie, wonderful as ever. Thank you very much to New Zealand Super. Quick thought for myself, quick, hopefully, reply, although the question is unfair. Just picking up on one of your themes. I mean, look, as a businessman myself, and you know, the vast majority of our activity is now in sub-Saharan Africa. We have portfolio companies there. And what I've seen over the last 8 years since I left the UN is just the desperate struggle from good entrepreneurs to secure, you know, whether it's equity or debt capital for their companies. And, you know, the flip side of that is if we do not support as investors the base of the pyramid, the entrepreneurs at the base of the pyramid looking to take advantage of digital and tech revolutions and to create services and products that, you know, supply frontier economies, there's a huge systemic risk growing up there, because a demographic bounce where Africa is 1.3 billion, it'll be 4 billion by the end of the century. After 2050, Africa will have more than 80% of the world's growth in population. If we do not feed and grow the fabric of those economies with investment, there won't be jobs, and there's huge insecurity and volatility. So my question there, and it's not really for you to answer, it's putting it out there, but the long-term risk of banking huge systemic risks is surely a huge issue for the deep pools of capital in the G7 and G20. And do you think that the deepest pools of capital and the people behind it take enough interest in those systemic risk issues? It's a bit involved, it's a longer conversation, Anne-Marie, but I think it's critical we invest in the frontier economies.
Well, you know, I think that good case studies can help convince those in the highest places. But it is a challenge. No, I don't think that enough focus is shown at how to attract that capital into what are unknown risks often for investors, for bankers. But there are successful businesses in Africa. You've familiarized myself with some of the digital revolution that's going on there, the small scale types of investment. I think we're learning through our own impact investments. We have a mandate called the Elevate Fund, which is just New Zealand, but I'm sure there's other types of funds elsewhere in the world where we're trying to prime a venture capital market. So we actually invest in venture capital managers. So we're trying to get that going in our own country. But I do think that those that have experience and really good stories to share in Africa and investing Africa need to have those amplified through the G7 and the G20 and work together, and with this robust governance model that has been shown with climate change and even more with COVID-19, to really address the issue and get the big players in the room, but also those from the countries that you're saying we should be investing in.
Anne-Marie, listen, it's a thank you very much for your answer. Dinesh has also commented on that idea of the flow of capital into the developing and frontier economies. One aspiration of mine is the UN-backed Principles for Responsible Investment apparently has $100 trillion of assets that now are aligned with responsible investment. Wouldn't it be lovely to see 0.5% of that a year, $500 billion, flowing into venture and bodies in the frontier economies? But let's keep that for another day. The clock is moving on. Again, New Zealand Super, thanks for your leadership. I'm going to go to Alexandra Noble of Pensions for Purpose, who's our respondent and has the unenviable task of taking an extremely rich smorgasbord and flagging up those dishes which from the first panel gained her attention. So Alexandra, over to you as the respondent to reflect on that first very rich panel and the opening comments. Over to you, Alexandra. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an absolutely fascinating first session and such an encouragement, to be honest. Just to hear a lot of the positive stories that we've heard already, it's so encouraging on the dull January when we're in the UK, the third lockdown. Although we've got the vaccine to look forward to, it's not terribly encouraging. So I'm going to do something slightly different because, as Paul rightly says, what an amazing selection of speakers, and what a lot to take on board. So I'm going to do this slightly differently, and I've just noted down some key words which I think will sort of pull everything together and for something for all of us to take forward. So I really enjoyed Professor King's comment about integrated thinking, and I think that's something that we can all ascribe to. And the idea of corona economics. We are, I believe, all becoming seriously aware of this is not just a viral pandemic. This is an economic crisis as well. And then moving on, the word holistic, which I have to say personally I love, because I think it's something that we should all aspire to, is to be holistic in who we are and what we think and how we invest and everything that we do. And moving on from holistic is the word collaboration which comes to mind. And I think seeing this panel in front of me, you know, how wonderful to have everybody across the world, this rainbow of people joining the conversation. And so collaboration is, I believe, going to be critical to moving things forward and for all of us to aspire to those SDGs, which frighteningly, we said we were going to do by 2030, and that's not very far away. So I think that from what I've heard this morning, there are some real transformation happening across the world. And whilst this pandemic has been absolutely horrendous for so many people, it's just so exciting to feel that there are some silver linings out there. So that's a real encouragement. But one of the most important things too is, I believe, education. And this is something that I see particularly in terms of my role with Pensions for Purpose, is that it's very clear that particularly from an investment point of view, that a lot of the large investors really want to be educated, really want to learn how we can make things better. So I think that behoves us all to focus on the education piece. I think another thing that came out to me was equality, or rather lack of it. And I think it's horrendous to think that we've backtracked on where we were moving towards making a more equal society. And we've ended up with the division between the rich and the poor, just creating a huge chasm. And I think Paul mentioned about the pictures that we saw, certainly in the UK, of all the people in India going home to their homes, miles and miles away from the cities. It was heartbreaking, to be quite honest. So I think that the other key words that came to me were integrated solutions as well as integrated thinking. Stakeholder capitalism, absolutely critical. We've really got to bring everybody together to move things forward. And of course, as Anne-Marie mentioned, the large asset owners have got a huge responsibility here to raise the bar. And going back to, I think, Professor Watchman mentioned about our moral compass, we seem to have slightly lost our moral compass, and I think we've all seen that. So that's another issue that we need to be aware of. And so finally, I think that the other key word, and I'm very conscious of time here, the other key word that comes across to me is leadership. And I'm excited to think that this group of people and the rest of the sessions that you've organised, Paul, and the time with the UN, that there really will become a strong leadership to move things forward and to make our world a better world in all sorts of ways, and that everybody can align themselves to the SDGs and really aspire to get to that 2030 deadline. So Paul, thank you. That's just a very brief comment from me, but hopefully those are a few words that we can build around.
Alexandra, I love respondents who make my job easier. That was fantastic, because 10 words, well, 10 points: integrated thinking, holistic, collaboration, transformative, education, equality, targeted solutions, stakeholder capitalism, moral compass, leadership. 10 points, giving a flavor for, as I say, it's a bit hackneyed, but a really rich smorgasbord of discussion from around the world, many different dishes and cultures. So, Alexandra, thank you very much. Back to you.
One more point. I realised that I missed one of the absolutely critical ones, which is the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and several people mentioned that. I think that's critical, and I was really interested to hear about the Elevate Fund, Anne-Marie, and that sounds very exciting. I'd love to pick up with you on that at a future date. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And look, Alexandra, we'll come back to you after panel 2. Let me thank all of the Jeff Kendall from Future Fit Foundation, Dinesh Goel from Siam for taking on the torch from Professor Watchman and Professor King, and a great first panel. So let me close that, and 9:30 the clock, I'm going to run across now, and we go into that second panel. So our first port of call is Azumi-san, and Oriental Consultants Global have been a very generous supporter of this process, and we thank you for that, Azumi-san. And I would invite you to make your comments from the Japanese and the international perspective, knowing how much work that your company does in the emerging and frontier economies as well. So Azumi-san, the floor is yours, and we start panel 2, and we'll come to Kun Kasemsit in Bangkok next, where I'm guessing it's late afternoon. But over to Japan, it's dusk The lights have gone and the floor is yours, Izumi-san.
Thank you, Mr. Paul Clements-Hunt, for inviting me and enjoying the session. From my point of view, I want to talk about something. I'm very happy to join this meeting from a country where the Prime Minister has just recently announced his environmental policy to change to aim at the carbon neutral by 2050, after being offered a fossil award by UNFCCC a few occasions. But let me start to talk about some of the issues on how business community in Japan. I'm delighted to talk about something in Japan. A change with a new what we call the new normal in society while experiencing the pandemic and also anticipating the post-COVID period. I want to introduce a new word for you. I hope maybe you are accustomed to visited several occasions in Japan. A word in English, like Japanese, called nominication. Does anyone know about a nominication, what it means? sorry to mock you. But the nominication is kind of an English word from Japanese. You can simply make it by replacing the first letter C with N of communication. So communication instead of the communication, take it C and replace it with N. Nominication is a common word among the Japanese business people to mean drinking, eating together after work at nearby cafe or bar or restaurant before each one goes back home. In fact, the after 5 off-duty or social gathering are one of the important occasions and practices, if I call it, for business persons to get together after a long day of work in the office. It happened in the past. But however, due to the COVID-19 and following the virtual lockdown in major cities in Japan, over 70% of business people are currently work from home. And the cafes, restaurants, bars, naturally, they are requested to shut down by 8 p.m. So in fact, due to those restrictions, those food service industries have been very much strongly affected. So in one of the cases, their sales have declined to 10 to 20% before the curfew. In fact, 80% to 90% down of the business. One of the quick responses to these kind of restaurant owners have applied to Uber Eats. Of course, it is not Uber itself, taxi services. Rather, in fact, in Japan, Uber tried to penetrate in the market, but unfortunately, so restrictions here did not allow them to do so. But instead, they are flourishing the business through Uber Eats. It's a bicycle, food beverage services delivered home. So in fact, Uber Eats, they have been introduced around the 15 countries in Japan as well, over 10 large cities in Japan, just as Tokyo, Osaka, and others. And therefore, the Uber Eats services, these are concentrated. When someone wants to take pizza, for example, so then the person will place the order via smartphone, and also in 20 minutes later, Uber Eats delivery staff will bring the food at the doorstep. Obviously, payment is done by payment services, nothing is unique. But in relation to the nominication habit, a kind of gathering after work, obviously people are working from home, but how can it realize a nominication practices kind of nominication party in each one stays at home? In fact, it's a very simple, a group of people, usually staff members of firm or with their customers, they place the order of food and drink together or by one, but its delivery time is the same at the doorstep of each one's house. So in fact, then you can switch on Zoom, and then we call it online drinking party and eating party, while you are knowing that what they are drinking, what they are eating, what they are talking each other. That is easy way to sort of socialize ourselves. So in fact, in summing up the story of this, nominication, I hope you may remember, maybe Paul, I need to ask you to learn some Japanese here, is designed as a real meeting, but now thanks to this digital innovation, digital revolution, people can enjoy nominication opportunity in virtual and real form. Let me introduce now the second topic, a bit sort of harder one. Now let me talk about how UN SDGs and the infrastructure and how we can mobilize capital and finance to emerging opportunities. This has been the main subject for me during many years. So sustainable goal number 9 says build in resilient infrastructure to develop quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure. But of course, we understand the sort of proportion and the sort of infrastructure gap is amounting to $15 trillion, and also which is represented by Africa about close to 40% of the gap. So large-scale infrastructure is very much needed, such as transport infrastructure, such as roads, railways, ports, and others. But those large-scale projects have a public-private partnership due to the mounting public debt of the developing countries, and particularly which is more accentuated because of the COVID-19. So there are many ongoing projects, but it has been criticized that target infrastructure was supposed to last about 40 years, but it may end up only just 10 years. What is this? So actually, I think as we may know that the World Bank has introduced a so-called life cycle cost procurement into 2017. And if we can ensure that good life cycle cost sort of principles, i.e. the initial investment cost higher, but the maintenance cost may be lower, then the lifetime cost will be lower at the end. This is one of the simple theory. So we need to bear in mind this kind of the opportunities, and hopefully we have the two pension fund represented here today. But in Japan, we know that the GPIF, Government Pension Investment Fund, as far as we know, this is one of the largest pension fund with over $1 trillion assets, out of which we understand about more than 45% of them are invested in foreign countries. I hope they can function as a sort of ultra long-term lender or investor to come into this kind of the investment with a good quality of the investment. Let me stop here, and just I would like to leave it to you back to Mr. Paul Clement-Han. Thank you.
Izuma-san, again, you light up the room. I love that idea of communication and gathering around Zoom. So on my Japanese, all I can say is "Ganbarimasu."
Yes, that's fine. Very
good. My hardest. But look,
I hope everyone understands the communication. Okay, just in place N with C with N. Sorry.
But it's linking to what Alexandra Noble said and picked up. Collaboration has to continue, and humans, exactly. I believe, are always fundamentally social. So we'll find a way. But if we can make that collaboration work at the global scale, and we can pull in the capital and assets and flow it different parts of the world, so your message is really well taken, Izumi-san, and it's always good to have you on board. So look, I will half an eye on the clock, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this. I hope everybody else is, because it really is a rich serving. And we're going across now to it has to be said, one of my favorite countries in the world, having lived there for 7 years. Putai Maidai, not a very good Thai speaker, but Kun Kesemset, who is a director of the Board of Trade in Thailand, also a former chair of the International Chamber of Commerce in Thailand, and has a very distinguished record in the investment world. Kun Kesemset, give us a flavor of how the pandemic and its ramifications across Thai society, and then how the business and investment community are seeing it. So it's great to jump from Japan to, I believe you're in Bangkok, and the floor is yours, Kun Kesemset. Khop kun manak.
Kun Khap, Sawadee Khap. Thank you very much for having me on this panel with a little short notice, and I'm sort of a filler in a last minute change to be on this panel, but it's such a pleasure and honor to be up here. I wasn't too sure what sort of comment which perspective I should take in making this little comment, but I will try and fill in from the Thai perspective on things. The pandemic, as we know, spared really no one, and it's clear everyone in the world is affected, and also showed how unprepared we are as a community, as businesses, as government. The Thai economy is very similar to most of the ASEAN 10 Southeast Asian country's economy structure. We are a manufacturing-led economy. And in the past 5 to 10 years or so, we have, in fact, weighted our GDP heavily on tourism. Tourism has been totally decimated by this pandemic. And it came so fast, so quick, and so rapid, and so vast that the country, the structure, is not prepared for. And so we came from 2019, 40 million tourist arrival, down to last year maybe less than 6. And you can imagine the chain of businesses that were affected by the disappearance of tourism economy entirely for Thailand. One good thing for Thailand is that we are still a major food producing country. So the farm sectors and the agricultural sectors has been the main absorbent of the massive sort of layoffs by the city employments. So I think that has been, I wouldn't say a good thing, but it's sort of smoothed out the shock, if we can say. We are an export-led, so the whole entire world economy has slowed down, and our export economy has slowed down as well. You see massive cuts and layoffs of workers in corporates, and particularly with the MSMEs in cities, which are a major pillars of the economy. They're vast in numbers. And the problem with this SME is that when they are folded and they close their shop and disappear, they don't come back. They don't come back at all. You know, unlike the big corporates where they can stomach this and they can weather or sit it out. And this needs to be a big challenge for the government. You cannot just live an economy without SMEs. And they contributed so much, and now they are so helpless. And the government are very slow into helping them. We see digital adoption at a massive level. I'm sure this is shared by a lot of speakers today. And this adoption has become mainstream, just like how we're doing Zoom meetings here. Zoom and other digital meeting platforms are norms now. And this new norms will not go back. I think they're here to stay. And how do we bring more people onto this kind of platform and get them accustomed to the new way of things? Health issues has become the center and key in every consideration, whether it's tourism, hotel, food, logistics. Those have all been a whole new factor into the equation of anything. You know, how we have come to this point, started with a health crisis to an economic crisis, and very likely a political crisis in many, many countries. For Thai Chamber of Commerce and the Board of Trade of Thailand, we feel that it's our role to help our members, SMEs, and company and businesses. And I don't think it's just a matter of relying on the government to do what is needed. I think everybody needs to chip in and help out at different levels. You know, we've been working very closely with the government to try and help boost the local economy in place of the tourism and the international, the exports-led economy that has sort of disappeared. There are many challenges. We have asked the government and worked with the government to try and subsidize for some of the local tourism, local travel. So we have the local picking up some of the slides by the international travelers, which is a far cry. I mean, from 40 million tourists, there's no way the locals will be able to replace that number. But at least we'll try and keep the fund flowing, some of the spending flowing. And the government has agreed to come up with a few measures to subsidize some of the travels, some of the food, hospitality, hotel bills for business travelers, for individual travelers, to try and promote some of those spendings. And it has helped somewhat. But then I think we are now coming into the second wave, which is creating a big challenge. We have also gone into the local community to try and because the farm sectors is, funny enough, is the sector that has picked up, because the cities, as I mentioned before, massive layoffs in different sectors, especially SMEs. You see a lot of shops closed. they all go back to the farm. And the farm sectors has been one area that has absorbed the unemployment from the cities. Because when the Thais go back to the upcountry or go back to their farms, they don't need a lot of things. They probably have their staple food, which is rice, and it costs much less than staying in the city, with an apartment and trying to keep up with the commute and the spending in the city. So the farm sectors has been massive. So we need to try. In fact, we are trying to ride on this new generation of city dwellers going back to the farm and bringing the management and techniques and marketing or whichever the digital savviness that they are accustomed to in the city to the suburbs, to the upcountry, and try to bring new knowledge. That's where we come in and help to educate. And so we've been doing our part instead of being, these farmers, this new generation of city dwellers going back to become farmers. They need to be doing smart farming. So they need to integrate the innovation, the digitization of the new era to try and bring the farming sectors up to speed. We have been going into the provincial chambers through our network of the Thai chambers. We have over 100,000 members in the Thai chambers and the Board of Trade. So we try and educate through the different chambers to try and raise the value of what they need to do in the value chain. Bringing value added to their farm, bringing new increase productivity, the quality, the integrated way of farming, differentiation, and picking the right crops for the farming. We have some very interesting examples that we have done last year. Most of the farming in Thailand are for low value crops like rice, maize, cassava, which takes up a lot of water, land, and yet the yield is very low and use a lot of resources. So we have been showing some case studies where there are some countries in Isan, which is the northeastern area of Thailand, to educate them to produce and plant something like cacao, which has a much better output from seeds. Just growing a crop of cacao for just the seed, you can yield 66,000 baht, which is about $2,000 per year per crop. Versus if you put even more value adds into the seeds and produce some dry beans from cacao, you can earn up to $10,000. And if you produce it all the way to a finished 100% chocolate, you can easily make $30,000. So those are high value crops that we are trying to educate and bringing the new smart farmers to understand. There are still a lot of crops that are suitable for a country like Thailand and different regions in Thailand, like asparagus, like ginger, grapes. These are all higher value crops that they need to be educated, because farmers are very difficult to change. They have been doing what they do for years, and it's very difficult for them to try and switch to a new crops. Where are they going to start? Where are they going to market? But in this day and age, the digital revolution has helped make things so much easier. We just need to educate them. I think that's one of the role at the Thai chambers. Apart from telling the government what they need to do, what we can help them to do, we also help to educate our members and the farm sectors up north. We like the government to. There's some we call it the low-lying fruits that governments can do while we wait. Things like updating the law and regulations. We have so many laws and regulations that are outdated, that are not enforceable. So this would be a good time while you can boost more exports or invite new FDIs to try and revise and update and get rid of some of those outdated laws and regulations that has hindered businesses all along. These are things that we have been pushing for the government to boost the infrastructure, especially on utility, especially water. If we are such an agricultural-based country, water management is a big part of what the government should be spending their resources on, which have always been neglected during the good times. We always face annually drought and flood at the same time, and these are all can be managed in this day and age. You just need to spend the time and the resources to do it. And human skill, of course, we want the government to, to talk about training, retraining, uptraining the existing workforce and equip them with digital literacy. So there are a lot of things that we do, what we can do, and we do it right away without waiting, without just trying to push for somebody to do it. We help to lead the way, and we hope the government will jump on, and different other agencies and corporates. In fact, we have a lot of corporates that have jumped on the bandwagon behind us and try and help and do their part. What is concerned globally from our end is the liquidity tsunami that we are seeing, with all the QEs and all the stimulus packages that are pumped by different central banks. And these are funds. Funds doesn't know boundaries. They flow to where they need to go, where they can find any yields, and they could easily flood an economy or market like Southeast Asia, like Thailand. And even we see how small these funds can come in, and it will create a massive other issues. For example, the baht, the Thai currencies has become overly strengthened, and with the central bank being very helpless and very limited tools to contain, we see a lot of a worry about the USD. Where is the dollar going with this massive pump out? And a lot of governments are holding a lot of USD assets. What are the implications going forward? And more importantly, how are these issues going to be unwind going into the future? We have really no solution for that. I think there need to be a mechanism where countries and different economies need to work closely, even more closely together in trying to come up with a health issue, human movement issues, fund flow issues. These are all very pertinent and very, very realistic issues that needs to be discussed. And we haven't got a platform where we can do that. We haven't got a host that would organize something like that and have something that is something like the WTO. The WTO regulate trades. We have restrictions, we have tariffs, we have a way how to regulate trades, but fund flow, human flows, very difficult. I think it's a very connected world, and these are all new issues that needs to be visited and needs to be analyzed. And of course, the VUCA world now, I mean, the digital divide is getting wider. I think one of the speakers mentioned about the social inequality is getting wider, and these are all new issues that will lead to even more disruptive and volatile market. Needs to more social unrest with whole new generations of the Gen Alpha, the Gen Millenniums that we don't fully understand how they feel, how they think, and they are now being fueled by the economic hardship, will bring them more out onto the streets and create even more unnecessary unrest that makes the trouble even more difficult to tackle from this point. So I'll leave it at that.
Khun Kasem said that was a wonderful economic tour de force. I mean, from the fundamental value is value in the land and the resilience model there in terms of the Thai economy, despite the unbelievable fall off of tourists. A bell went off in my head. One thing from political economy, which always registered with me, was Ricardo and Ricardian economics, and his point that the fundamental value always is in the land. Now, Ricardian economics missed out to liberal and neoliberal economics, and look where we are. But it was a wonderful analysis, but also filled with hope in terms of resilience of the Thai people going back to the land and that idea of smart farming. So I can't thank you enough for that. I think we really have. We've run around the world in a wonderful way, from communication to the value in the land, and that's been wonderful. Let me jump on with half an eye to the clock, and thank you again, Kumanakapa. I'm going to go across now. I think we go south and east a little bit, and we have Gordon Noble, who, in my estimation, is one of genuinely the world's leading thinkers in and around. To also say he's a partner in my company. This has been a rich discussion. I'd love you to bring the Gordon Noble mind and thought and lens to it in terms of what you've had, but also obviously what you're seeing in Australia, which I guess of many countries in the world has perhaps Australia and New Zealand have floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. I assume everyone can hear me. Look, I'll just take a few minutes, and I thought can you hear me, Paul? Is it all? What's the reception like?
Fine. It's perfect.
That's great. Look, I've taken some notes, and apologies for being off the video while everyone was talking, but I wanted to take some notes as everyone is reflecting. What I would like to do is very quickly just go through some of the key things that I've picked out, and obviously I'm going to be missing some of the comments. So it's not to say that the comments were not important. But to start on the comment around Professor King's comment on coronomics, because I think that's been the essence of the conversation, that we've got two crises that we're dealing with simultaneously, and I think one is going to continue. There's been just to highlight a number of comments from individuals. Anne-Marie kind of highlighted the digital revolution. We had a bit of discussion from a number of participants around the way economies have been shifting around the digital revolution. And I think what's evident is, and we'll come to this at the end, but we saw the willingness and the ability of workers in particular, and I don't think we've acknowledged this sufficiently, to shift rapidly. Literally, the word pivoting has been used many times. In fact, probably overused, but we saw that in the way every household has needed to shift their own arrangements, personal arrangements, just to simply make it through the week. Jeff Kendall's comments really resonated, particularly the comments around the illusion of resilience. And from an Australian perspective, we came into COVID-19 off the back of a summer of bushfires that had ripped up and down the east coast of Australia. What those bushfires demonstrated is, I mean, they literally isolated individual towns to the point where military needed to come in and actually rescue the populations. But what they also did is, we had smoke alarms going off in city buildings for weeks at a time, and a lot of this was probably evident and this is what really COVID is sort of telling us, that a lot of the things that we're seeing in hindsight were we should have known, but we weren't taking the warnings, we weren't taking the lessons that we should be listening to. Anne-Marie O'Connor again made some comments about, look, the SDGs need massive investment in frontier economies, and Paul, you framed that as to what that's going to look like, and some of the challenges around that. Paul Watchman was highlighting the need for professionals. Just very briefly, we talked about the law community, but and I'll bring this together with, because we tend to think when we talk of a financial system or business, we talk as it's just the pension funds, it's just the banks, and really, I think for instance, what the legal community says to me is that this is a whole system, this is an ecosystem. I love this word nominication. Look, from a Melbourne perspective, we're in Melbourne here in Australia. Every time that we have a meeting, if we have international visitors, we go and have a coffee. We take them out for coffee. Most of the meetings and discussions in Melbourne, it's our culture is to do that over a coffee. And I know that's not the case in some parts of the world, but I think that's going to be key. That kind of element of how do we bring together the digital disruption, the fact that we can't do the things that we were doing. We're simply going to have to change some of our new norms. I think as it was referred to. So I've got 4 points that I like to make just to draw all this together. The first thing is what we saw with COVID is that we can pivot when we need to. We did it. You know, individuals, businesses have been forced to pivot. In terms of the financial system, the question I've got for the financial system and businesses, but particularly the financial system, is the financial system has largely been in a reactive mode over the last 12 months. Different parts of the system have been doing different things. The banks in particular, their loan books have been most affected, and they've needed to be probably the most proactive. The question I have is the financial system watching because it knows that it's going to need to act, or is it a rabbit stuck with in the headlights of a fast-moving truck, and it literally doesn't know where to go? That's my question I've got, because I think what we see with the need to pivot is that's the question that the financial system has to face. How is it going to pivot? Because this gets then to my third point about the choice that I think we face as a financial system. And Jeff Kendall's comments around enlightened self-interest. So to me, how I interpret this is, there's really a test, and the word leadership was used a number of times by a number of different participants. But does the financial system take leadership? Does it actually start to take that proactive leadership, or is it the bunny with the truck bearing down in the middle of the road, and it literally faces its consequences? Because there is going to be consequences in terms of, just as a comment that the last presentation around the volatility of markets, we are going to see that. I think that's the challenge. So the idea that a financial system can be hoping that COVID goes away and going into a nice new normal might change a few things. I think where we're heading, what Coronanomics means, is we're really heading into quite a volatile time. And this is where I come back to that last word, nominication. And to me, this is the key. And this is the key to conversations such as this, Paul, that you know, the blended capital has been able to drive over a period of time. And we've seen from the first webinars that you organised with Professor King and Professor Watchman how things have changed over that course of the last 12 months. But to me, the way I interpret nominication is the idea that we need to collaborate. We need these kind of conversations. We can't rely on the fact that there will be somebody who's got it all worked out. And I think it will be from conversations such as this and many others, because that's the nature of how we would term it in Melbourne as the coffee culture. You're literally having many conversations. But through this, you're building that best practice, and particularly the idea that we need as a financial system to pivot to the environment that we're moving into. I'll leave it there, Paul.
Noble, Gordon, not Noble. Gordon, thank you very much indeed. I've only just made the link that we have two nobles on one call, which is obviously a very noble thing to do. Both of you, thank you for participating. That was terrible. Alexandra, I was going to bridge to you just for a couple of minutes in terms of wraparound final observations before we go to closing comments with Judge Professor Mervyn King, and then Professor Paul Watchman to finish. It's been super rich. Alexandra, what did you hear from this session? And again, just briefly for the sake of time, but your first respondents summary covered so much, and I think it remains relevant. But over to you for a quick insight.
Thanks, Paul. I will try and be as brief as I can be, but we've got a few more words to add to the first list. Nomification, clearly very exciting. As I mentioned in the chat bar, in the UK we've called it virtual cocktails, so I think we will get that one. I think the other really important thing that's come out of the second session as well is digital solutions and transformations. I mean, Zoom obviously being one of them, but that really has changed for everybody. Another thing that came up again, which sort of links into the first session, was the demographics, the populations moving, people moving back to the land, thinking about doing things differently, thinking about the way that, you know, what they're producing and how they're producing it. I I guess I've got a bit of a question about the logistics, but we can come back to that. Another really important factor I think that was brought up, particularly from our contributor in Thailand, was the issue about laws and regulations. It is time for a complete review, and I think Professor Waterman also mentioned this earlier. I think there's got to be a serious review about all the regulations that are just sitting on the statute books, that it's about time that some of them were got rid of, for lack of a better phrase. I think a couple more key words, water management. I think that's a key issue for everybody around the world, and that sort of obviously links into SDG 6. The ecosystem, going back to the legal point, I think that ties in. That was mentioned several times. A very interesting comment from Gordon about, is the financial system watching? I believe and hope it is. There are going to be consequences which are going to be totally new, and I think we've got to stop thinking about the new normal. I think it's a different normal, and the coffee culture, the collaboration which came up last time, absolutely key. And I think my final word, which I think ties both sessions together, is leadership. We need to see some serious leadership to move things forward on a global basis. This is not small town anywhere. This is global. So I think those are my key words for this last session, Paul. Trying to be as brief as possible.
So Alexandra and Gordon Noble and Kun Kasemsit and forgive me, and Izumi-san, thank you for panel 2. It was really rich and really good. Before we go to concluding comments, just a little bit of housekeeping so everyone's clear. The conversation since last June, which started in South Africa, and before we had the conversation with Professor King and Professor Watchman, this really came out of a UN process. The Blended Capital Group were working with the UN in South Africa to kickstart a flash peeler fund looking to raise 136 million as a response to COVID-19. So that's where the thinking really started, and this has resulted in the dialogue. Now, the dialogue we've had and wonderful thought leadership paper from the Future Fit Foundation has caught the imagination of the UN at a global level, which means our conversation over the past 8 months and today and the one this afternoon will be taken into a UN meeting, a dedicated meeting to our meeting on Thursday, the 28th. And towards that, we are capturing in the conversation something called the Waterberg Declaration. Now, briefly on that, Waterberg is a region in the Limpopo province of South Africa, which is one of great natural beauty, but also pockets of severe poverty. And the reason we've called this the findings and recommendations of this process, the Waterberg Declaration, are to relate to the fact we started in South Africa, but I think anyone anywhere in the world can relate to the idea of Waterberg, water mountain, and in terms of the importance of nature. So just flagging, on Thursday, we will present our recommendations to the UN, and it's the UN World Investment Forum as the Waterberg Declaration. From January the 28th through till the end of December, when the World Investment Forum should meet in person in Abu Dhabi, that declaration will remain open, and we would encourage investors and businesses to become adherents to the declaration. And it's to maintain this conversation, to give it something to the UN which is powerful. And I mean, if I put my hand up, one of my objectives is really the issue of seeing how we get funds flowing to entrepreneurs in Waterberg or entrepreneurs in the hometowns or in different parts of the world. So I hope that rushed explanation is not too much, but you're part of a global process. We're taking recommendations to the UN, and we're going to continue the conversation afterwards with the UN World Investment Forum. And let me say one final point is that this conversation has really caught the imagination of the UN. So thank you for your input. Thank you for your time and commitment. I'm going to go across to Professor King for some brief concluding comments, and then Professor Watchman to close. But again, sincere thanks from the Blended Capital Group. Thanks to the Legal 500 for providing the technical platform, and all of you speakers. So Judge Professor King, over to you, then to Paul Watchman, and we're done on our first of 4 events this week. Professor King.
Thank you, Paul. I just want to conclude my remarks through the prism of the limited liability company, because this is the chosen medium through which most businesses today are conducted. And it is the medium which was set up by society for society to raise capital and create jobs. People call it today society is the licensor of the company, but in fact it was created by society for society. And the company is an incapacitated artificial person that has no heart, no mind, no soul, and no conscience. The conscience of a company is in its corporate leaders, the directors. And this has led to my founding the Good Governance Academy, because the realization, and Professor Watchman's point, that young lawyers, aspirant accountants, should no longer be taught as we were taught, first of all in silos, and secondly, the primacy of the shareholder, for example, realizing that the company actually operates in a triple context of prosperity, people, and planet. And it has a huge impact on those three, and those three have a huge impact in turn on the company. So education is a critical issue. And consequently, I founded the Good Governance Academy, and I have thought leaders from around the world. And through my travels around the world and talking and lecturing at universities and different business schools in the countries all represented here today, there was a realization that not every institution, tertiary institution, actually thinks or teaches today accountancy, for example, in the same manner. I mean, who would have thought that a faculty of accountancy would have philosophy as one of its major subjects, simply because of an appreciation that through artificial intelligence, the drudge work of double entry bookkeeping, and you're drafting a balance sheet, you could press a button and get a balance sheet on a daily basis today. So, but what you do need is the accountant to be the advisor, the true change maker in the C-suite. And he or she has this training on public interest issues. So I wrote my book, Chief Value Officer, with the subtitle, Accountants Can Save the Planet, which led to much debate. And they are turning out to be the change makers in the C-suite, because an understanding that there's enterprise value creation. The success of a company is no longer going to be increased profit, increased dividends, increased share price. The success of a company is going to be measured, has it added value to society? That's going to be the critical issue. Has it been able to eradicate or ameliorate the adverse impacts which it's had on the environment? These are the critical issues that are going to be asked. The question, the most important question today is, how has the company made its money? And so in finding an answer to that, you start seeing whether there are adverse impacts on these three critical dimensions for sustainable development. So the Business Roundtable of America in August of last year said, we directors should no longer focus just on the primacy of the shareholder, but should take account of the interests of all stakeholders. The commentary then changed. Commentators started calling the primacy of the shareholder capitalism, and started talking about taking account of the interests of stakeholders, stakeholder capitalism. Well, the error of corporate leaders under the primacy of the shareholder was to believe that increasing the wealth of shareholders at the top, wealth would trickle down to the impoverished at the bottom. It didn't work. The trickle became treacle. It stuck at the top. And so we've got our inequality gap, and we had the tragedy of unsustainable development through the 20th century, with companies using natural assets faster than nature was regenerating them, clearly not a sustainable matter. So the thinking had to change. And I was a party to the founding of the International Integrated Reporting Council, and integrated thinking has become a critical issue. And followed by that was the SDGs in 2015 of collaboration. And we've seen evidence of it in the collaboration to find a vaccine. What usually takes 4 to 5 years has taken 9 months, but through collaboration by various countries. So collaboration is absolutely critical. Then on the inequality gap, I think we've got to look at reducing the remuneration at the top, increasing remuneration at the bottom, but the remuneration at the top should be variable, and that is to look at prosperity, people and planet. So £1 million salary, but bonus is whatever it is, 1/3 of it goes to, you say that the EBITDA earnings is going to be $7 million. Well, if you increase that, you'll get 1/3 of your bonus. During the fiscal year that we are reviewing, these were the adverse impacts on the environment. How are you going to eradicate or ameliorate those in the year ahead? Another 1/3 of your bonus. And the same issues with society. These were the critical issues on health and safety, or dealing with what's happening with sweat labor in the supply chain. How are you going to eradicate or ameliorate that? Another 1/3 of your bonus. So the executive can still earn, but in earning, his mind is focused on increasing value to society and increasing value to the planet. Much more palatable to people walking in the streets of the cities of the world. And finally, I just want to point out that this language of the removal of the privacy of the shareholder, commentators have called it, that was shareholder capitalism. They have now taken the situation where we should take account of the needs, interests, and expectations, and I believe hardships of the stakeholders of a company, but always make a decision in the best long-term interests of the health of the company. Because we get that right, it's in the best long-term interests of all the stakeholders. And they've termed that stakeholder capitalism, a phrase which has often been used today. It's a dangerous phrase because the era of corporate leaders of the 20th century was to focus on the interests of the shareholder. If directors focus on the interests of all stakeholders, well, the company will go bankrupt. You make decisions in the best interest of the company, which results in trade-offs between the interests between stakeholders. For example, changing from fossil fuels to renewables to drive your plant and machinery. So for 3 years, you're saying no dividends to shareholders to increase your cash flow, to change to renewables. Well, one would think, and that's in the long-term best interest of the company and all the stakeholders, including the shareholders. One would think that the share price would go down. Well, experience has been in the European Union and companies that have done that. BlackRock, for example, has said, this is a board that has applied its collective mind to the long-term health of the company. And in the bulk of my $6.3 trillion I've got to invest is to be paid out in 25 years' time to my pensioners. So I've got to make sure the longevity of this company. And so it should rather be called inclusive capitalism. Exclusive shareholder, inclusive capitalism. And the coalition of inclusive capitalism was formed some 6-7 years ago in London. I was privileged to be there. Bill Clinton was there, Lady Rothschild, Paul Perlman, and the coalition of inclusive capitalism was formed. So I'm just saying the phrase stakeholder capitalism has got red flags written into it. And I prefer the language of exclusive capitalism and inclusive capitalism. Thank you, Paul.
Professor King, wonderful. And before I go to Paul Watchman, I'm going to say my thank yous. Izumi-san, thank you very much indeed. Gordon Noble, Alexandra Noble, Kumke Semset, Dinesh, Amri O'Connor, Jeff Kendall, thank you very much. And over to Professor Paul Watchman to close after Judge Professor King's wonderful comments. We'll continue this conversation and hope you're enjoying it. So Paul Watchman, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul. I, like others, have made a list of certain expressions, certain terms that have come out of the talk today. Before I do that, I'd like to just thank you and Legal 500 for putting all this together. It's been a very stimulating few months and has certainly changed my thinking, improved my thinking about things. So my themes, I have integration, corona economics, cartography, interconnectivity, communications, and integrational inclusive capitalism, which I'll explain at the end. They're in no particular order, but I thought I would start with Professor King's ideas about integrated thinking, and others have added integrated solutions. And we see this impacting on banks and law firms, asset owners and investments. ESG has perhaps been one of the most powerful tools for getting bankers and other professionals and companies to lift their head above the balance sheet, to go for another bottom line that assesses what impact they have in communities and society. The integrated thinking is very clear in terms of good governance, and good governance for me underpins everything, because if we can't trust the companies, if the companies make bad decisions for short-term profit, then they are going to run not only economies into the ground, but there's going to be social disruption and unrest. And I think it's important too that we see companies changing, I think what Professor King just mentioned, the reward structure for their officers. And that's very important, that they are focused on not only financial reward, or financial reward is based on a wider set of criteria than at present. Corona economics, which is a lovely phrase. So we've pivoted away from neoliberal economics. Can I, like Mark Kearney, who recently gave the Reef lectures, I suppose defend Adam Smith? As a fellow professor at Glasgow University, but a few years earlier, Adam Smith not only wrote The Wealth of Nations, in which he hardly mentions the invisible hand of the market, but he also wrote Moral Sentiments, which is a much broader and important work that's neglected. I love the fact that we have pivoted away from neoliberalism towards a proper appreciation of Smith and neo-Keynesian economics, and now with Professor King, Corona economics, and that has been so important. And one of the things I do mean to look at is what happened after the Spanish flu in 1919, 1920. I think we all had parties for a very long time. The next word is cartography. I love the fact that when we talked about the loss of our moral compass, I was immediately topped, I suppose, or trumped by Future Fit Foundations, who came up with the sat-nav for sustainability, which I thought not only is alliteration, but it is a nice way to put it, that we need leadership, but we need a map to get us from where we are today to where we want to be. Another word was interconnectivity. Climate change and the pandemic do not differentiate between the rich and poor, between those in Western society and those in Eastern society. It's very important that the solutions that we propose are not national or continental, but global solutions. And without doing that and taking a holistic approach to things like gender and race inequality, social immobility, and education, we're not going to get there. Communication, the word, can I get it right? Nomication. Mnemonication. It's a fabulous idea, but what's fabulous about it is the human ingenuity to realize that they're missing that interaction and the importance of human interaction and the use of technology. We come back again and again to the fact that technology can be used to improve a plantation farmer, planting crops effectively and economically in India or Africa. So technology should never be underestimated. And lastly, my idea of intergenerational initial inclusive capitalism. I was once at a ESG talk, and I was on the panel, and we were asked the question, how long, what should be the time horizon for investors? And the Church of England said, the second coming. And I said, no. In the words of Buzz Lightyear, it's to infinity and beyond. And I think the point that Professor King makes is a very valid point. We do have to make sure that whatever we do things in the long-term interest of the company. So it's refining things, but it's not running the company into the ground by pursuing objectives that are going to undermine economies. So I'd just like to say thank you very much. It's been wonderful hearing from you, and it's been very stimulating hearing so many views from around the world, but also views that have a consistency or a coherence, which is very impressive.
Professor Watcham, with thanks. We've run slightly over, so thank you for staying with it. We've got a second one of these this afternoon. Some of you are involved, but we're going obviously west to Brazil and the Americas and Africa as well to catch the time zones. So again, with thanks, this is not the end. It is continuing. Think about the Waterberg Declaration. It will be circulated post today. We'd love you to have a look at it. It'll be a short document, but it is about fundamentally how we pivot, how we flow capital into different parts of the world, but how we begin to deal with these pockets of poverty post-COVID. And that's it for today. So again, I'd like to thank you all. Wonderfully rich conversation. I think we all know, and also to emphasize the point, this video will be taken and put onto a UN platform. So hopefully the message will go out to thousands of people in the course of time. We will also at the end of the process do a short 4 to 6 minute video capturing the whole year of discussions. So that's some editing job. So again, with thanks to all of you, Gambarimas, Izumi-san, and we will speak to you soon. Thank you for your commitment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.